Welcome to all. I'm addressing you from the galleries of Sakıp Sabancı Museum in Istanbul, where we are currently hosting the exhibition focusing on the work of calligrapher Şeyh Hamdullah, organized to commemorate him on the 500th year of his death. I would also like to greet Professor Cemal Kafadar, who will be speaking today on the occasion of this exhibition in collaboration with Columbia University Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. Şeyh Hamdullah, famous calligrapher and founder of the School of Ottoman Calligraphy, lived in the late 15th and beginning of the 16th century. His patron was Bayezid II, first as crown prince in Amasya, where he resided as governor, then as sultan at the Topkapı Palace, where the artist created his best works. Professor Kafadar will illuminate today in his speech the background of this great artist and calligrapher and the role of Sultan Bayezid II, still a controversial figure in the Ottoman history. I would love to greet you once again and hope to welcome you in our galleries in the near future and give now the floor to Professor Cemal Kafadar.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nazan Hanım. It's a great pleasure, it's an honor to be here. Though I wish I were really at Sabancı Museum and with a live audience, as we all do these days. Can I have the other pictures? Can I move these pictures? Okay. I wanted to start with this picture, which I went to take yesterday, a selfie in front of the poster, because I wanted to at least, since this is not live, this is not in person, which is something I miss very much, and it's actually my very first lecture, because I'm on sabbatical on Zoom, trying to get the hang of it. I went there yesterday to take this selfie because I wanted to commune with Şeyh Hamdullah and with the museum and my dear colleagues, the curators and the staff at the museum, who kindly invited me and assisted me in preparing for this presentation, which I'm honored to present. And the title also indicates what I was hoping, what I am hoping and planning to speak about today, despite the fact that I heard in the social media some people suggested that it was a lecture about Şeyh Hamdullah, which this is not exactly, as Nazan Hanım said in her introduction. It's more about his time, about his patron, Bayezid II, and also about the culture of the book in the age of Şeyh Hamdullah. We recently published a book, two colleagues and I, Gülru Necipoğlu and Cornel Fleischer. The three of us edited a volume with more than 20 contributors on this amazing document that surfaced a while ago, but hasn't been studied comprehensively and exhaustively, we thought, and we wanted to put it together. This is an inventory, an unprecedented kind of document in not only Ottoman history, but in all of the glorious past of Islamic libraries before this age. There are some inventories, but nothing this systematic and this elegant. So we wanted to bring together a group of colleagues, as we did eventually, to study the different topics, different subjects, disciplines treated in the inventory, which lists more than 7,000 titles, more than 5,000 volumes, but obviously some volumes have several titles. The largest library of its time that we can gauge on the basis of what's published so far, but it's definitely one of the largest, even if there are new discoveries to be made. So this group of colleagues, with the three of us as editors, we worked together to publish different sections on books on medicine, on mathematics, on exegesis, so on and so forth. And it finally came out relatively recently. So this is also partly a book reading or a book presentation. Soon after it came out, the pandemic started. Nobody's been able to check out the two volumes, one of which, the second, the thinner looking volume is not so thin, actually. It contains the facsimile and the transcription. The larger volume contains introductory essays by the three editors, essays on different disciplines covered in this inventory, as I said, things like exegesis, hadith, medicine, mathematics, literature, Persian, Arabic, so on and so forth, and two essays by two dear art historian colleagues who looked into the art historical value of some of the very precious manuscripts. Those are Zeren Tanındı and Zeynep Atbaş, I'm sure well known to some of you. So, while working on this book, I was also naturally working on Bayezid II, on the age of Bayezid II, as well as his father, Mehmet II, whose library is also presented here. It's mostly the two generations, though there are some books left from Murat II's time and even earlier, very few. And collections of those two sultans, Mehmet II and Bayezid II, are very well represented here. And we worked on their age and the culture of the book in that age, which naturally brings Şeyh Hamdullah into the picture. Also, talking and working on Bayezid means, especially for his formative years, working on Amasya. That also brings Şeyh Hamdullah into the picture. But even if this book has nothing directly about Şeyh Hamdullah, though there are echoes, and I will show you, because some of his precious handwritten volumes are represented here in the catalog, but it also represents something for a practical work like this, for a list of books. After all, it's merely a list. The elegance of handwriting, the elegance of presentation, the design of the page, my goodness. This is the binding. The volume itself, MS Turk, is, some of you will recognize, a Hungarian designation, because the book somehow, we still don't know how, the inventory ended up in Budapest, which is where it is right now. And this is one of the pages. This is the table of one of the table of contents pages. Tafsil is a chapter, let's say. Tafsil of books on a topic. Tafsil of books on another topic. It goes on and on like that over 20 or so disciplines. I thought I had another slide here. Okay, that's good enough. It gives you a good idea of the kind of project that we have been involved in and that led us to the age of Bayezid II, to Amasya, to Şeyh Hamdullah, and the culture of the book at that time. Now, let me talk more briefly about how this project in particular, though I have been thinking for many years on this, but this project in particular led me to rethink and reassess the age of Bayezid II. First, a few more general points. Allow me, please. Policy at the grand level of states and governments, or in our daily lives for that matter, is a matter of choosing among options to intervene on matters so that we give them a desirable or more sufferable shape. That much is obvious. We could be misperceiving our options, of course, and we are probably never going to be able to have a full view. But whatever we perceive to be our options, they are there to choose from, and each one will come with consequences. In thinking about Ottoman history at the level of the so-called grand strategy, or just the larger narrative, really, which we are always embedded in, we are often acting with the assumption that conquest was the default policy of choice. If one could, one would conquer. That is the Ottoman way. Those who objected, like Çandarlı in 1453, Çandarlı Halil, could be written off as acting with treacherous self-interest or some kind of weakness, like wimpishness or effeminacy or excessive introverted piousness, which is sometimes attributed to Bayezid or Bayezid II and Murat III later. The great success of Ottoman historiography, as well as modern ideologies, is that it made this the natural way to look at Ottoman history, to make us think in that manner, whether we ourselves are gleeful or not about expansion and conquest. I am not sure if that is indeed the logic of Ottoman history. Surely there is something very important to it. I see the significance and the validity of this line of thinking to a certain degree, but I am not sure it deserves to be the only perspective. First of all, I see a different rhythm prevailing than an incessant drive to conquest dominating Ottoman action. I rather see a back and forth between a strong-willed, if you will, a hard push toward expansion and conquest, but also, and not only in the age of Bayezid II, a kind of soft pedaling on all this, with different priorities emerging. All of this could be seen as simply attempts at calibration, which it is to some degree, or more explicitly and deliberately matters of different visions. That is what I think we haven't done enough with in Ottoman studies in general. And all of this is a matter of degrees, a matter of concoctions. I don't think one needs to look for absolute choices in this or that regard. Moreover, conquest itself could be consent building from the point of view, at least, of the beneficiaries and those who celebrate it. But policies geared toward or prioritizing conquest and expansion also implied, among other things, expenditure and revenue, taxes. The circle of justice is all about that delicate balance between the military coercive power of the state on the one hand and the sustainable maintenance of a productive tax-paying re'aya, or of productive tax-paying subjects. For the latter, for the subjects to offer their consent, and the key word here is the one that I'm now trying to think about analytically, which I don't think we've done enough with, except maybe in the case of Sufism, but bring it to the level of political choices and political thinking. For the subjects to offer their consent, rıza, certain conditions had to be met. Above all, some consensus that zulm, or tyranny, or injustice was negligible or mitigated when brought to the attention of the state, and justice prevailed. Nobody, but for 21st century ideologues, nobody was blind to the fact that in this world of the two worlds, that is, on this real world as we live it, zulm is, or tyranny, or injustice is never eradicated. And there is no absolute justice. It's only a matter of degrees and calibrations and expectations and criteria. But expectations and criteria there always are regarding what was palatable and sufferable. And these kept evolving over time. Building or manufacturing consent in the 15th century, say, was certainly not the same thing as building consent in the 18th. Different sultans, or rather different administrations, even within one regnal period, one can see differences of attitude based on changes of cabinet or divan members and some significant vizirial appointments. Different sultans, or rather different administrations, evidently articulated different sets of policies with different priorities. This was partly a matter of circumstances they found themselves in, and I'll turn to Bayezid in that respect, and partly a matter of deliberate choices. I believe we in Ottoman studies have not focused sufficiently on consent building as a matter of policy. Studies of patronage, particularly patronage of public charitable endowments, both from an architectural and urbanistic and social history point of view, do shed significant light on this. That's the best part of the Ottoman studies corpus that I believe enables us to deal with the idea of consent building. But consent, winning the consent of millions of people is not only a matter of doing things, best represented by construction, imar. And I don't downplay it, that's a big deal. Imar is always among the important items on the menu of any sultan or vizier or statesman. But consent building is also a matter of not doing things. I am reminded of Lao Tzu, for instance, the Chinese sage who advised rulers already in the first century of the Common Era to be like cooks frying small fish. The less you meddle, the less muddle you will have. Consent is also a matter of letting things be, recognizing autonomies. It is also a matter of not imposing new conditions. Bidat in this kind of context is often used for unprecedented taxes. Bidat, a word that literally means innovation and is used in many other categories, can, with respect to a discussion of justice versus tyranny, often imply a new and unprecedented tax. So consent building is a matter also of not doing things. I was arguing, recognizing autonomies, not imposing new conditions. It is also a matter of not having your armies on the move all the time or too much of the time. What is the precise measure? Nobody had one, but these were negotiable and discussable, debatable items on the minds of the public, in the minds of the public. With this, I can turn to Bayezid. Lately, there's growing interest in his reign and in reassessments of his reign. I have to here really give credit to at least 2, 3, there are several, but Cihan Yüksel, my dear colleague, Nenad Filipovic have done great work to rethink the reign of Bayezid II, because there is a growing feeling that one needs to think of Ottoman, the grand narrative of Ottoman history beyond this incessant drive toward expansion and conquest. Oscar Aguirre recently finished a wonderful dissertation on Bayezid's literary patronage and much more, so on and so forth. So it's coming with a good conversation, robust conversation with some of my colleagues, which I enjoy. Whether that conversation actually takes place or is more a matter of reading and writing, it's happening. Now, Bayezid, obviously, especially of his era, the least acknowledged, the least noted, the least celebrated, the least recognized, especially if you think of modern Turkish political views on Ottoman sultans, it's the most embarrassing gap for us historians when people refer to Fatih Yavuz Kanuni, Mehmet II, Selim I, Süleyman I, as somehow constituting a holy threesome, where you know that there are 3 decades in between the reign of Bayezid II that somehow is given short shrift without even a reflection or without even a debate on this. So on to Bayezid. First, brief rundown of the 4 major characters here, 3 of whom are much better recognized, if not the dates. Their names are all over the place, obviously, on public monuments, buildings, projects, but Bayezid II, not quite. Unlike his father and his son, Sultan Bayezid II, I'll now give you more of a reading from our recent published book with my more later revisions and some commentary. Unlike his father and his son, Sultan Bayezid II was more interested in peaceful and orderly administration than in conquest. He thus worked harder on manufacturing consent than on wielding coercion. Not to be confused with a flat-out refusal to use military force. This is more a matter of a different balance of policy. Bayezid certainly did not refrain from conquest or coercion, or from policies that struck many of his subjects as oppressive, perhaps even cruel. Yet many of his contemporaries described him as unwarlike and moderate. The Crimean Khan, for instance, his contemporary, asked the Sultan in a surprisingly forward letter if the duty of jihad was no longer in force, now that the Ottoman army had remained inactive for some time. Bayezid replied gently but firmly that he too was mindful of the duty of jihad, but reminded the Khan that the sultans had the unique responsibility before God to maintain order in the realm so that subjects could flourish, and that such order is vulnerable to disruption by the ill-willed when the sultan and the army are on the move too much. With all this in mind, Bayezid wrote, he devoted his time day and night to investigating and managing the affairs of the people. He owned this managerial approach rather than denying it and being defensive about it. There is also a matter of a difference of temperament here. Tursun Beg, contemporary chronicler of the time of both Mehmed and Bayezid, writes after Mehmed's demise, with great admiration of the deceased Sultan, the conqueror, that he was sometimes too ready to give in to wrath. Gazap is the word he uses. Whereas Bayezid, he says, is identified by hilm, moderation. That reputation seems to have rendered Bayezid a figure of lesser significance and accomplishment in the eyes of posterity, particularly in modern historiography. He certainly was active on the military front at times. In 1484, the conquest of Kilia and Akerman completed the Ottoman conquests encircling the Black Sea coast, more or less. And then he had successful military moves in Lepanto and Motoni on the Mediterranean and Duresh on the Adriatic between 1499 and 1501, just before the commissioning of this book inventory of the palace library, and I will come to that point. And he did, of course, engage in various memorable things, such as allowing his realm to become a refuge for the Jews and Muslims expelled from Iberia after 1492, building naval capabilities of the Ottoman state. But these are always presented either as lesser matters or simply in a defensive gesture rather than as part and parcel of one particular ruler's vision and deliberate choices in the face of circumstances as perceived. A modern historian, for instance, characterizes Bayezid's reign as a period of transition from the old heroic age of the 14th and 15th centuries to the new age of grandeur, a period of consolidation before conquests were resumed. I wonder if Bayezid was really considering himself a transitional figure. In terms of his record as a patron of the arts and culture too, Bayezid's legacy remains captive to two dominant narratives. On the one hand, he is stuck between Bellini and Sinan, two iconic figures of the patronage of Mehmed II and Süleyman I, respectively. Also, his victory over his brother Cem has been perceived as a kind of turn in Ottoman history that modernists eventually felt shouldn't have been taken. In other words, Bayezid's victory over Cem presents Ottomanists and people who think about Ottoman history with the biggest what if of Ottoman history. And in this counterfactual account, Mehmed knew what the Renaissance was all about, and Cem was going to pursue the same, but the pious Bayezid took over and things changed. So the what if also turns into an if only in the hands, in the minds of some historians and history buffs. There were deep-reaching transformations in the social order throughout the 15th century that he needed to take into account. I won't dwell on those. That a sultan's power is always limited, at least by the realities of the outer world, and actually much more, but by the realities of the outer world, I want to remind you of. So deliberate choices, visions matter, whether it's Mehmed or Bayezid, only to a certain degree. And the reason Bayezid reversed some of his father's policies was not merely a matter of temperament. Rather, the Sultan and some members of his administration felt that some of Mehmed's policies were unsustainable. For instance, Mehmed's policy of confiscations of endowment lands, more than 20,000 villages, according to Tursun Bey, who was a bureaucrat in the finance bureaucracy. Those confiscated lands were taken from endowments and turned into miri land to be distributed as timars, and created many discontents, and Bayezid turned around and reversed the policy. The reversal was consistent with many of Bayezid's earlier and later actions, which prioritized consent. Already as a prince based in Amasya, he had raised objections to his father's fiscalist measures and defended the townspeople of his princely residence from various exactions. Moreover, by the end of his reign, Mehmed II had created a large number of resentful subjects due to various policies, which were considered harsh and tyrannical. Some of his construction projects had led to taxation, which in the anonymous chronicles of the time and the stories of the Hagia Sophia and the history of Constantinople are identified precisely as acts of overtaxation and insufferable. Beyond that, the intellectuals Mehmed dismissed, alienated, marginalized, or worse, is a veritable list of the most accomplished and original minds of his time. So in all of these respects, towards the end of Mehmed's reign, whether it's a matter of temperament, but more than that, in my opinion, a matter of all kinds of other choices made, led to a large set of discontents, which Bayezid was also trying to appease. Time-wise, okay. After his first successful military campaign in 1484, we do have the emergence of the first huge corpus of Ottoman historiography, which I find relevant for this discussion because that corpus, Aşık Paşazade, Oruç, and several anonymous texts and some others, certainly represent in varying degrees a voice of opposition and discontent. I don't mean Oruç was an opposition figure, but even his chronicle contains some of those resentful voices. And when you move from Oruç to Aşık Paşazade to the anonymous chronicles, these are the major examples of the huge corpus I am speaking about, which emerged after 1484 mostly. You do have different degrees, sometimes harsh criticism represented in this body of material. And I think, even if not encouraged by Bayezid directly, his reign, the tone of his reign, indirectly encouraged this emergence of the first substantive textual layer of public debate in Ottoman cultural life about the Ottoman polity. let me mention that in terms of their policies toward their libraries, though this will take far more study than I can currently use for examples, there seems to be a great deal of continuity in the way the library acquired materials and worked on them, and that's topic for further study. Though obviously there are a few different choices made. I should also mention that contemporaries speak about Bayezid as a great bibliophile, not only in terms of his relationship with Şeyh Hamdullah, but a great bibliophile who spent hours studying his books. And indeed, on several of the books in his collection, there are notes that say he perused them. Mütalaa is the term of this close reading or study that some texts have as a record, studied by the Sultan Bayezid II. Bayezid was also attentive to the growing interest in Oghuz lore, just like his brother Cem. And in this respect, I can just mention two examples. Cem's son was named Oghuz, which the bottom of this slide, you see the note on that. And this is certainly a very conspicuous interest in Oghuzism, as I called it in my essay for the volume, in the body of Oghuz lore that was on the one hand disappearing, but at the same time attracting, as it often happens, a great deal of interest among intellectuals as something of the past. In fact, Yazıcızade bemoans the passing of the relevance, the resonance of Oghuz culture. So, but obviously not altogether. Some people took an interest. There were revivalists, and Cem named his son Oghuz. But let's not forget that Bayezid, a few years before Cem, named his son Korkut. The tales of Dede Korkut were getting their first textual version close to this moment. We don't know if it was associated with any Ottoman ruler. The text mentions both the Akkoyunlu and the Ottomans. We don't know who exactly the patron is. Does not matter so much as noting that the tales of Dede Korkut were attracting attention, certainly recounted numbers of times, maybe hundreds of times orally, and Bayezid named his son Korkut, and he also had a daughter named İlaltı, clearly avatars of the good old days of the Oghuz. Some brief look at their terms of governorship. Bayezid was going to be appointed in Amasya in 1455 and stay there until 1481, which is the time of these close relations with Şeyh Hamdullah, also 26 years at least. Some people say 27. Okay. Amasya. Now, it is well known that Bayezid brought a group of intellectuals and artists from Amasya to Istanbul, and he invited them later, perhaps, but also commissioned works. Atufi himself, the librarian who put together that inventory, is from Merzifon, who was part of the Amasya province. I'm using Amasya here both as the city and the province. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into this. And this is only about the role of Amasya, by the way. The city of Amasya itself, in terms of its architectural and urban history, is being studied by Damla Özakay. If she's listening, I'd like to salute her. You should really be looking forward to her study of Amasya, where you can understand the city in its context, in the environment much better. But in terms of the role in that larger narrative, let me say a few words. The city of Amasya was the princely residence of Bayezid for 26 years. Much like Bayezid himself, the significance of the city in Ottoman history has not been properly recognized due to what it was not. Namely, Bayezid was not recognized because he was not much of a conqueror. Amasya was not recognized because it was not a prelude to Istanbul like Bursa and Edirne. Nor was it a place that would be treated as a stage to the ultimate telos of Ottoman history. Amasya was, however, much more than just one princely residence, among others. 3 of the 4 rulers of the 15th century came of age and cut their teeth in politics there, Mehmed I, Murat II, Bayezid II. Both winners of the 2 bitterly fought internecine wars of that century, namely Mehmed I after the interregnum and Bayezid II after his struggles with his unfortunate brother Cem, were Amasyan. The city could also be at the crux of the next big struggle, would also be at the crux of the next big struggle among brothers, namely the sons of Bayezid II, which I consider the second interregnum between 1511 and 1513, which was lost by the Prince of Amasya, namely Prince Ahmed, and the winner was, of course, the Prince of Trabzon, Prince Selim. Amasya continued to be relevant in the struggles among princes all the way into the 1550s in the wars between Selim and Bayezid, the 2 sons of Süleyman the Magnificent. In short, Amasya was arguably at the center of more than a century and a half of Ottoman political history. Moreover, the second thing I want to underline is it was for a long time, for more than a century, a frontier province, a Serhat province. The easternmost region held continuously and securely by the Ottomans for more than a century, from 1399, brief interlude after Timur Lane, until Çaldıran. Amasya, the center of the province, and the province itself should be considered the hub of commercial, political, intellectual, Sufi networks traversing Ottoman and Iranian realms. The city and the region were receiving thus a good number of migrants. Şeyh Hamdullah's grandfather or father is supposed to have come from Bukhara, one of the grandfathers. Müeyyedzade family is supposed to have its origin in Divri, Sivas. Atufi, the librarian, says his grandfather moved from Arapkir to Merzifon, etc., etc. And thus, as a center of attraction, Amasya boasted some of the most accomplished poets, Sufis, scholars, artists, and physicians in its heyday. Mihri Hatun is probably the best known of female poets in Ottoman history, and it is amazing that she has a regular place and a fine critical reception in the nearly all-male universe of the biographical dictionaries of Ottoman poets. She was a member of a notable family. The Tacizade family is well known. The Müeyyedzade family is well known. Sabuncıoğlu Şerefeddin. Let me move to this page with some further intellectuals and artists mentioned. And here I should mention that Gülbahar Hatun, during Bayezid's time in Amasya, played a major role in developing cultural and political networks for her son. Also was clearly a part of the body of regents and tutors around the prince. And we know that she also had a difficult time with Mehmed II in the late 1470s when Mehmed wanted to confiscate part of her land. But that's another matter. Some notable intellectuals and artists of Amasya, I started naming them. Sabuncıoğlu Şerefeddin and Amir Devlet Amasyatsi are amazing examples of great originality in medical practice and thinking. Şerefeddin is a great surgeon, much better known in Ottoman studies. Amir Devlet Amasyatsi was an Armenian of Amasya who became a court physician at the time of Mehmed the Conqueror and continued in that role into the 1490s. Atufi, the Liberian scholar, not much known until recently, though I hope will be better known because of the inventory that should bring him credit. Not necessarily our publication, but the inventory itself should. Şeyh Hamdullah, the Tacizade family, need I mention, a very important series of bureaucrats, poets, littérateurs in Amasya first and then in Istanbul. And Şeyh Hamdullah himself, a legend, a larger-than-life artist whose life is the stuff of hagiographies. I mean, if you read various things about Şeyh Hamdullah, you find that he was attributed near miraculous qualities in certain respects. For instance, the fabulous late 18th, early 19th century historian of the city of Amasya, Hüseyin Vazih Efendi, writes that Hamdullah Efendi was born in Kürtler Köyü, where he learned, that is, Hamdullah learned, the art of calligraphy in a cave from none other than Hızır. It's a kind of miraculous transmission of the power to perform great art. There are, of course, similar stories about Sinan and quasi-miraculous happenings in his life. There is also the story of his discovery in Istanbul. He was an unknown, but then from a slip of paper that he wrote, Bayezid apparently recognized the handwriting and invited the great calligrapher to the palace. There are such stories that are really of the stuff of hagiography, saintly anecdotal collections that pepper his record, his legacy. He was said to be, and that's probably not hagiographic, he was said to be a great sportsman, an archer, many calligraphers were, hunter, Bayezid was, and the two of them were known to have gone on many hunting expeditions together, and a big swimmer. This one again goes in the direction of stories of saintly hagiographies, because he was said to be such a good swimmer that he could in the morning swim from his Üsküdar to the palace, to Seraglia Point, go to the palace and instruct the Sultan or do whatever work he was meant to do in the palace that day, and then go back down to the shore and swim back to Üsküdar. I love this story. I just don't want to say it's not true. It's a great one. So it's that kind of a place we are talking about in the late 15th, early 16th century. Hub of all kinds of networks, a great role in Ottoman politics for more than a century, a key role, the easternmost province, and the home of so many fabulous intellectuals and artists. Time, okay, a few more minutes. I turn to the late 15th, early 16th century as something that should not be seen as merely a stop on the way to Çaldıran. I don't have much time to develop this point. Let me just read a couple of sentences which will give you an idea. Surely there were apprehensions about the growing influence and ambitions of the Safavid order circa 1500. But the matter was not as alarming at that time as it would become after a few years. Two chronicles happened to come to a halt in 1501, namely the one by Oruç and the other by Behişti. They corroborate this picture by providing a fascinating perspective on anxieties caused by the rising Safavid challenge without the sense of an inevitable military do-or-die clash as a necessary consequence. It is yet another instance of the tremendous hegemonic success of Ottoman historiography after Selim that Ottoman-Safavid relations are described with Çaldıran as the inevitable consequence of irreconcilable differences that set the course of those relations from the outset. Not if you read the letters of Bayezid to Ismail. Several of those letters survive. And the matter clearly appeared differently to the Sultan and his cabinet in the first decade of the 16th century. In his letters to the young Ismail, Bayezid regularly insisted on one concept, rıza, consent. He advised Ismail again and again that he should stop his military coercive policies and he should engage in policies that would win him the consent of his subjects. He could have been naive, he could have been this and that. We could really evaluate this in different ways, but that clearly is what Bayezid was driving at. As far as the development of the pro-Safavid sentiment among his own subjects, what was then called the Kızılbaş movement, first Erdebili and Kızılbaş were accusations or characterizations which turned pejorative in the hands of the majority eventually, but Bayezid's policies in this regard were not that meek or simple. He did basically engage in three kinds of policies: to prevent the flight of the population out of Ottoman Asia Minor to Iran under the threat of execution and confiscation, to transport rebellious supporters of Erdebil, i.e. of the Safavid order, to Moria, and to extend his patronage over the Bektashi cult of dervishes by sending Balım Sultan, which he discovered in his new hunting area, Didimotikon, after he became Sultan. Dimetoka was the area where the shrine of Seyyid Ali Sultan, also known as Kızıldeli, became of interest to Bayezid II. And Bayezid there found a sheikh, Balım Sultan, who would agree to go to Kırşehir or to Suluca Karahöyük, now called Hacı Bektaş, to extend control, to be the second founder, as he is known, of the Bektashi order. It must have been around the same time that Bayezid ordered the construction of a lead-covered dome over the tomb of Hacı Bektaş, buried there in the late 13th century. This ultimate gesture of imperial patronage is recorded as such in the final chapter of the Vita of Hacı Bektaş Vilayetnamesi as a grand deed, and it is the concluding chapter of the hagiography. In 1501, Bayezid had won his biggest military victories in the Mediterranean, Greek Mediterranean, and in the Adriatic, what is now in Albania. And he returned to the capital with clearly different things in mind. As the diplomatic negotiations were unfolding, Bayezid could change his pace and focus. He refrained from any further undertakings and remained sedentary in Istanbul. Now he turned his attention to cultural patronage with greater intensity and focus. Not only was this a matter of respite from military mobilization, but also of riding high on the prestige of victory. In July 1501, construction started on the Mosque Medrese complex in Istanbul, Beyazıt Camii Külliyesi. Within the same month, an order was sent to Monastir in the Balkans, asking a certain Müderris Ali Çelebi to dispatch a book of history that his father was known to have compiled, namely a history of the House of Osman, Tevarih Ali Osman, which was part of Bayezid's range of interests that I indicated before. One of the earliest surviving registers to systematize the procedures for the tenure clerk of assistants in madrasas also starts during the same month. It is also during the same years that the İhtisap Kanunnameleri, the market regulations of Bursa and Edirne, were put together. Another very interesting, very important, unprecedented type of document coming from Bayezid's administration during this beginning moment of the 16th century. In short, the first years of the 16th century presented an opportune moment for Bayezid to take stock of his library, as well as to consider the quality of education and learning in the palace and beyond. Thus, he commissioned Hayrettin Hızır Atufi, one of those many talented Amasyans who eventually joined Bayezid's circle to prepare the unusual document at hand. Atufi earned himself a place in some biographical dictionaries of scholars, such as the famous one by Taşköprüzade, Şakaik-i Numaniye, but he earned no more than a paragraph and no more than a citation here or there, didn't really make it into the upper echelons of the great Ottoman ulema. In hindsight, however, Atufi's Defteri Kütüp, the defter of books that we're looking at, could arguably be considered the crowning achievement of an otherwise unstoried life. Just as in our own day, the labor of a librarian seems to have received less than its due. He is remembered in all biographical accounts for his quote-unquote substantive works, exegesis, medicine, hadith, not highly renowned, as I said, but recognized, which were unfortunately for him considered respectable, but not much more than that. Yet a close reading of the unique book inventory Atufi prepared presents us with a remarkable and so far at least unparalleled intellectual endeavor. It could be seen as an early instance of the same early modern context, with its qualitative and quantitative leap toward an archival order around the rigorously structured, practical, and artistic documents that surveyed and counted and listed things and people on paper, in tandem with a growing place for texts in the public sphere, including but going also beyond that of holy texts. Let me just show you some slides from this collection. Here is the page that gives you the Kanun, the rules by which he says, it's a preface, the rules by which he says he will implement the practices, the procedures to complete the inventory. And he says specifically that some of these procedures were instructed to him by Bayezid the Sultan. Here we see Şeyh Hamdullah. How? Here, a detail of a page, Tafsir al-Masahif al-Azizati, noble pages, the chapter on noble pages, namely Quran, the Holy Quran. And here you have two at the very top. I don't know if you see after the red line, two at the very top are Qurans attributed to the hand of Yaqut, then two Qurans attributed to the hand of Argun, and then three Qurans attributed to the hand of Ibn Sheikh, familiar to the folks at the palace for whom this inventory was prepared, for Bayezid above all. Ibn Sheikh meant Şeyh Hamdullah, and that is how he appears here. Do I have time? Let me show you just some of the practices of this great librarian and Bayezid and his milieu, and I am sure Şeyh Hamdullah was a regular consultant for this great venture in the culture of the book. The book, or the more calligraphic hand in the middle, is the original title of the book, but Atufi was instructed to give his own titles and identify by field every work. The more cursive handwriting at the top is Atufi's own hand. And here the almond-shaped seal at the lower left is the seal of Bayezid II. When we had these two things, we knew that this item was in the inventory by Atufi, and indeed we found in the inventory, as instructed by Bayezid, the exact same title, the inventory, and this cursive upper right on the left page, titulature, appears precisely as such in the inventory itself. Here, Kitab Jami Daqaiq fil Mantiq. Fil Mantiq identifies every work, something, in this case, mantık, identifies every work by discipline. And he was instructed by Bayezid to do that. And he did that for every work. In this case, the work happens to be one of mantık and logic. And he was also instructed to give the very same title, including the identification by discipline, on a sticker, on the binding, and that is what we see here. Fastidious, meticulous, task-driven librarian. Even a longish title appears here fully on the, because this is a mejmua, this is a compilation, so it's a collection of various titles and disciplines, but it still appears on a sticker. Very few of these survive, unfortunately, of the stickers. Let me pass that one. This is one of the Chronicles of Time, Mu'ali, I believe. Yes. Now, this is Divan-ı Mihri, Dohteri Mevlana Belayi. This has Bayezid's seal, the almond-shaped seal, but it does not have Atufi's handwriting, and it does not appear in the inventory, because clearly it was gifted to Bayezid by Mihri after the inventory was prepared in 1504. Bayezid had 8 more years, and we know that Mihri was active, flourishing, and writing during those years, and she must have gifted it at some point when the inventory had been completed, but it still entered the library with Bayezid's seal, without Atufi's hand. Let's also note that we always call her Mihri Hatun, but on her own, maybe this is by her hand, but probably something commissioned by her, she calls herself Divan-ı Mihri. This is just like poetess versus poet in modern English usage, when people have abandoned the use of the word poetess, because a poet is a poet, male or female. And likewise, Divan-ı Mihri is just like Divan-ı Zati or Divan-ı Baki. Doesn't need a gender identification as such. And I think that was her attitude here. This is a very sad one. This is Divan al-Marhum Jem in Sultan. This is Atufi's handwriting again. This probably used to have here, see there's some corruption on the page. This must have had Bayezid's seal where that corruption appears. This Jem's Divan, the unfortunate prince, must have arrived in the palace along with the body of the deceased prince, and with some of his belongings, and entered the palace library. Bayezid, Atufi lists this in the inventory. So it was included in the palace library catalog. But eventually it somehow left the palace library, and it is now in Bursa İnebey Haratçızade collection. There's a very interesting note by a later hand here which says, Vefat Jem as Sem, poison, from the death of Jem from, it's rhymed, the death of Jem from poison, Ba'de tecri enva şetm der Rim Papa. After the slow application of all sorts of humiliation at the gate of the Pope of Rome. This is a later owner of the book, presumably, who took this note. Every book tells, every manuscript tells such a story, and every manuscript is an event in the history of that book. This is another volume dedicated to the reign of Bayezid and the wars between Bayezid and Cem. Sultan Bayezid Gazi, Sultan Cem ile mabeyinlerinde olan vakayı azim ve gayridir. But this is not Atufi's hand. This is a later hand. And this, I will leave you with this. This again has a seal of Bayezid here. This is one of his major interests, one of his major collecting interests, namely Sufism. Sufism constitutes the largest part of the palace library at that time. And this is the Makalat of Şems-i Tebrizi. I'm sure Şeyh Hamdullah was looking at different, admiring some, criticizing some, and probably also advising folks to do this and that during the venture of preparing the inventory. So I will leave you with that. Is anyone here? Öyle mi? Do we have time? Okay, I don't mind. Okay, one question about Bayezid's infrastructural investments, which could have led to financial constraints and thus thus maybe neglect of his accomplishments. I agree with this, yes, a good deal of this is true, but in general, when you pitch expansion and conquest and military victory as the top priority all the time of the Ottoman polity, I think infrastructural investments do not get the kind of attention they do. Even for Süleyman, you know, let's leave aside Bayezid. Süleyman's greatest financial investment, and I asked this question to several colleagues and history buffs, it's hard to predict. It's not Süleymaniye, you know. It's not, Selimiye is not his anyway. It's not Süleymaniye. It's his aqueducts. It's his investment in bringing water, the water distribution system that he created with, of course, again, Sinan's aqueducts and all of the connections to the northern forest of Istanbul. Infrastructural investment in general is not sexy, does not get the kind of attention that I believe it fully deserves. That's a very good question. Thank you. Second question, how influential were the circles of crown princes? Why the scientists and artists supported? Excellent question again. Influential on what? Influential on the prince, certainly. I think for Bayezid, just to dwell on Bayezid, but I could also talk about Cem. Let's cut it short. His mother, I mentioned, Çandarlı Ibrahim, who was in that circle, Şeyh Hamdullah, clearly, it was a tutor. Şeyh Hamdullah was older than Bayezid. And figures around the prince of that sort are influential on the prince. To look at it differently, Müeyyedzade Abdurrahman, a friend of Bayezid, a peer of Bayezid, was considered a bad influence by Bayezid's father, Mehmet II. Perhaps you know the letter that Bayezid wrote in defense, saying to his father, "Don't worry, I'm not indulging in opium and other things other than for some health concerns, and I don't have friends who lead me in those bad directions." But Müeyyedzade left for a while for Iran because they were afraid of Mehmed's wrath. So influences of all sorts, peer influence, influenced by tutors, elders, mothers, and scientists and artists are supported partly for prestige, partly, but I wouldn't really reduce it to prestige. A prince, if he is ambitious, knows well that they have to have distinguished people around them who are not distinguished because of name recognition only, but who can offer them good advice, sage advice, who can offer them networks to scientists in other parts of the world. A good scientist might know well about what was happening in the medical profession in Iran or Italy. And all of those kinds of information, knowledge, would be useful for a sultan eventually, already as a prince, but they're thinking of a future, and they're often entertaining ambitions toward becoming future sultans. And thus they support scientists and artists also to learn from them, in my opinion, to develop themselves. Combination of all of these factors. Do we know anything about the correspondence between an Armenian? I do not. I wish I did. This Amasyatsi is so little known in Turkish or in general in Ottoman studies, which is unfortunate. There is, in fact, an Armenian language, which I cannot read, but I looked at the pictures, Armenian language manuscript in the palace collection, long after Bayezid, but it is in the palace collection today among the Gayri-İslami yazmalar. And the frontispiece of the manuscript has a picture of Amasyatsi. The character was well known once. Modern nationalisms do one thing after another, some of them good, some of them bad, but ultimately they created these different fields that don't speak to each other much, and it's unfortunate that we haven't considered this question so very well. But given that he has a name like Emir Devlet, he probably was well versed in Persian. His pharmacopoeia, a stunning document of more than 4,000 herbs and plants and substances and their medical uses. It's a pharmacopoeia, one of the best in world history, actually, has vocabulary in Armenian and in Latin and in Persian and in Arabic and in Turkish. Not all of the time, but many hundreds of Turkish words are there of local herbs and plants. So obviously they were colleagues. They spoke to each other, but I wish I could reconstruct that world. I'm sorry, I can't. As it is now, the 16th century was very important for the development of Ottoman record-keeping practices. Precisely, it seems to me that both Şeyh Hamdullah and Nishanji Tacizade Jafer played crucial roles. Is that true? Here, I would say yes. In the case of Şeyh Hamdullah, not directly maybe with regard to record-keeping practices, but in developing an overall culture of the book, both with regard to elegance, but it's not only elegance. Obviously, I mean, a good artist is not merely about elegance. Nazan Hanım should be telling you all this much better, she would tell, but it's also a matter of using the information and the media and the space efficiently, efficaciously. In all of this, I'm sure they all, a good bureaucrat, had a lot to learn from Şeyh Hamdullah. But I don't know of any of his direct influences on record-keeping practices. With Nishanji Tacizade, certainly, because he was the head of the Chancery, one of the most important bodies of the Ottoman administration. And as Nishanji, he would train and he would supervise the training of the up-and-coming scribes. The whole scribal class is particularly significant, Küttab, in developing the Ottoman record-keeping practices, obviously, and again, the culture of the book. So Tacizade, definitely. I think we should do more formalistic studies, art historians type of formalistic studies of humdrum defters. You know, just look at defters and see the formal presentation and changes in that formal presentation over time. And somebody with a good eye for calligraphy might detect conversations between the two kinds of writing and the two kinds of skills as they evolved. But these are excellent questions. New defter types, that has a second time. Well, the earliest surviving Ahkam defteri, I didn't mention it, is from 1501. There must have been earlier ones, but in Ahkam defteri, which is published by Feridun Emecen and İlhan Şahin a long time ago, Ahkam Defteri of 1501 is clearly a prototype for the later serialized mühimme defterleri. And it could have started, it could have initiated in that particular form. Surely there were hükms given by earlier sultans, but to put together an Ahkam Defteri in that particular form, the earliest I know is 1501. I believe Yeniçeri Mevacip defterleri have some innovations during the reign of Bayezid II by the bureaucracy of his time. So more could be done in this regard. His divan, that's a good question. Is his divan recorded in his library? I don't think so, but I could be misremembering. I'm getting a bit tired because of the it's my very first Zoom lecture. Maybe I did mention it. I don't remember seeing it in the library collection, though there are more than 7,000 titles, and I misremember. I may. The follow-up to that question, or the second part of that question, is: do I consider Bayezid's reign as significant, as brilliant an age of cultural life as those of Mehmed and Süleyman, as those of Fatih and Kanuni? It's very hard to make these comparisons. I'm sure you recognize it's very hard to scale different kinds of accomplishments, because there are different kinds of accomplishments. But for the sake of a conversation, I would say yes, definitely. It is, for all kinds of reasons, one of the most noteworthy moments of Ottoman cultural life, the 3 decades, when I say moment, and of the late medieval, early modern world in general. And they build on one another. Obviously, his legacy cannot be assessed independent of the library collection of his father fully, or independent of the grandees of his father's time. But in a way, he brought back some of the people alienated by his father and gave them a second chance. Someone like Sinan Pasha, one of the most original minds, to me, of Ottoman intellectual history, the late 15th century intellectual, son of Hızır Bey, the first Qadi of Istanbul, and presumably, so says Lami Çelebi, of the family of Nasreddin Hoca. His family was based in Sivrihisar, and people in the 16th century thought they were descendants of Nasreddin Hoca. Anyway, Sinan Pasha is a great philosopher, great intellectual, one of the first to write in the Turkish vernacular 3 works of very serious prose, the most famous Tazarruname. It's amazing how the Turkish vernacular, coming into its own for the first time, is used in that very high register by Sinan Pasha, who also has works in Arabic. As I said, he's a mudarris, his training is in Arabic, clearly. And Sinan Pasha was kicked out of the palace, kicked out of Istanbul by Mehmed, and almost executed. Other scholars intervened and saved Sinan Pasha's life. And then when Bayezid brought Sinan Pasha back, Sinan wrote 3 works in Turkish vernacular of that high register, which I find extremely impressive. By the way, it ties into with the earlier question about mothers and circles around the prince. Gülbahar Hatun wrote a letter to Bayezid after Bayezid, as Sultan, brought Sinan Pasha back to recognition and back to a good position and back to a productive career. Gülbahar Hatun, the mother, wrote to Bayezid in a letter that survives that this was a very good idea, that she really admires people who admire Bayezid, and that Sinan Pasha is well worth the support of Bayezid, that kind of thing. Gülbahar Hatun herself was part of a scholarly family, and that too should be remembered. But clearly, she could be influential on his son regarding some of these cultural decisions. Rıza ve imar politikasından halk nerece haberdardı? How informed was the public of Bayezid's policies of consent and construction? Well, construction is a bit more obvious. I didn't mention, for instance, that he was really engaged in road construction, which almost every sultan was, but Bayezid was quite eager in that regard. Consent policy, well, ultimately remember, he's remembered as the saintly, the veli. So whether they were aware of it as a policy, which I don't think was necessarily formulated and pitched as such. It's my own analytical formulation of this. But among the populace, he eventually acquired recognition as Veli, Bayezid Veli, the saintly one. That really says something about his reception in the public eye. Very good question. Follows up on this. Okay, he favored consent, or he wanted to follow such policies, and he was interested in books and in reading. But was he also interested in the education of his public? Yes, like other sultans. I was just hesitant reflecting on whether I could say, was he more so? Was he particularly engaged? Right now, nothing occurs to me in that manner, though obviously his charitable complexes included educational institutions, book collections, and he did commission the writing down of books. His age saw the textualization of many oral traditions. I know I'm not answering your question exactly or directly, but these are related matters. And that's all that comes to my mind right now. Thank you. Can you say more about Bayezid's options and choices regarding Sufism? His interest and patronage are clear. Do you have a sense of his deeply? Yes, he was interested. I mean, his patronage, his relationship to, and his patronage over the Halveti order of dervishes is much better known for good reason, and reminds me to cite another relatively recent book or work by Hasan Karataş, for instance, who worked on Amasya and the Halveti order, which enables us to understand this development in the age of Bayezid much better. So there's a lot happening with respect to the age of Bayezid II. And he was closely connected and had his mentor in the Halveti order of dervishes. Amasya, the city, had also a good Halveti connection and a flourishing Halveti network after a while. He also had this interest clearly in doing something with the emerging Bektashi cult of dervishes, or Bektashi order of dervishes. I mentioned that already. Was he drawn to a deeper engagement with the practice, like his grandfather, that is Murad II, who abdicated, perhaps related to his deeper engagement with Sufism? I would imagine so. Yes. Deeper engagement, at least at the level of sohbet, seeking the companionship of Sufi figures, and thus engaging in conversations with them. To that degree, certainly, and his library does also reflect. Mehmet's library already contained a good number of books on Sufism, but Bayezid's library reflects a remarkable growth in that category. Questions are raining down. Aisha says, thank you. I believe one more question, because I see it on the screen, I might as well answer. Are there any Jewish manuscripts in the Palace Library? If there are, do you know their content? Okay, this raises another question. If you allow me, I will broaden the question. For Jewish books as such, the only book I know is an alphabet of the Hebrew alphabet. Namely, there are different instructional books in the Palace Library that were or were not used. Sometimes we cannot be sure, with different languages. There are many multilingual dictionaries, for instance, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Armenian, Latin, and Serbian. Multilingual dictionaries of 3, 4, 5, 6 languages. There aren't dozens and dozens of these, but there are several. And there is one Hebrew alphabet, a small book. By the way, this inventory does not contain all of the collection of books. It contains all of the collection of books in the languages of the Islamic world, so to speak. I'm just cutting a few edges here, namely in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. About 80% of the books are in Arabic, about 15% are in Persian, only about 5% are in Turkish. But Turkish was just becoming a vernacular written language in a significant degree. You go half a century after Bayezid, you'll find Turkish books to be more than 20%. You go to the end of the 16th century, Turkish books are more than 1/3 of the library collection. But this is the way it is in this collection, with a few mentions of Syriac works. Some of the multilingual dictionaries, by the way, include Syriac. And some, at the very end, are listed 12 translations of holy books that are not the Quran, namely 4 or 5 translations of the Old Testament, 4 or 5 translations of the 4 books of the New Testament, mostly Arabic, 2 in Persian, these translations, and 2 translations of what are known as the Psalms of David. So Zebur or Mezmurat. Those are translations from those languages. Sometimes clear that they're translated from Greek or something, but sometimes we don't know exactly from what language they were translated. So, but beyond all of these books compiled in this inventory, Gülru Necipoğlu, my dear colleague and wife, found in several different palace archive documents references to a number of un-Islamic books, let's call them. Gayri-Islami is the current designation in the Palace Library. That's why I use that term. Namely, books in Latin or in Italian or in Hebrew, maybe. I don't know. But those are not ever fully catalogued to the degree we know anything today, though they may have been, and we may be able to discover some further documents. Gülru saw some lists. Sometimes they're given as just round numbers. So many books in one chest, kind of a number. So there were, beyond what was inventoried by Atufi, there were, it seems, more than 100, not in thousands, but more than 100 books in languages other than the languages of the Ottoman world. And there are books obviously written by, not in this collection, later on by Jewish scholars, but not in Hebrew. Namely, for instance, Moses Hamon, the physician who came from Iberia eventually to the Ottoman world and became a famous dental and general physical doctor. And he wrote books, but I don't think he wrote them in Hebrew, not in those in the Palace Library. Raising all of these interesting questions. What can I say? I think it's 8 p.m. and it may be time for us to stop. I'm once again grateful to Sabancı Museum, to Nazan Hanım, to Ayşe Aldemir, to Burcu, who helped me all day today kindly with the technical matters. I hope it went smooth enough for you not to be lost. And I do thank also all of you for attending, listening, and the wonderful questions. Thank you.